On May 11th, 2011, Hannah's step-siblings were watching Hannah through the window, and they were starting to get a little confused with how she was behaving. She was sitting outside in the cold, and she was starting to thrash around, almost like she was having a meltdown, maybe, or that she was just trying to make a scene. But Hannah was never that kind of person. She was really quiet and reserved, but they didn't really ever get to talk to Hannah because she was usually outside. But then things just went worse. Hannah started to bang her head on the ground and then she started to rip her clothes off. Hannah was 13, so she would obviously know not to take her clothes off in the middle of the night. It was like midnight around this time. And it was cold. This is Washington State in the springtime, which can get anywhere from around 5 to 8 degrees Celsius or 47 to 50 Fahrenheit. So it gets really cold. But then Hannah's step-siblings watched Hannah just fall face first into the ground. So they went to their mom, Carrie, and were saying that Hannah had fallen and they didn't know what was going on. And like most moms, you would think that Carrie would go and run and check in on Hannah, see what's going on. How did Hannah even get outside? It's like midnight. But Carrie was already so annoyed with Hannah. She had been so passive aggressive all day, so now what is she doing? But then when Carrie went outside, she saw that Hannah was naked, and now she's even more annoyed. How dare Hannah be naked? It was so crude, it was immoral, it wasn't what she was supposed to be doing. She wasn't being trained right. She was already so annoyed with Hannah's behavior since Hannah had gotten here in the past 3 years. So she went outside and grabbed a bed sheet for Hannah and threw it over Hannah. Then she would go and ask her sons to go and bring her inside. She becomes more annoyed because now she has to go call her husband Larry to come home, and then she needs to go and call 911 and say that her daughter is being rebellious and tried to kill herself. When she finally called, the operator tried to get Carrie to perform mouth to mouth, but Carrie was just so annoyed because Hannah had mud all over her mouth and she just didn't want to do this. She just was so annoyed that Hannah was so aggressive and she was just creating so much stress in Carrie's life. By the time Hannah would get to the hospital, she would die. She had bruises all over her body, which was just a small portion of the abuse she suffered. Her hair was shaved, and she was naked, just wrapped in a sheet. Hannah would die from hypothermia, abuse, and malnutrition. She was severely underweight. She was so thin you could see her ribs. It was very clear that she had been starved to death. Hannah was 97% lighter than your average 13-year-old girl. And by the bruises and the malnutrition, it was very clear that this was no accident. And today, we will be talking about the case of Hana Alemu. Welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen. With me is Akira. In our podcast, we talk about all sorts of things that are true crime adjacent or anything that we find interesting. Today's episode will have themes of abuse, neglect, racism, and overall just like shitty fundamentalist Christian values and like the shitty adoption agency, stuff like that. So if any of that is maybe too much for you, or you're not in the right headspace, feel free to check out another episode of ours or go and take care of yourself, and we'll see you in another one. All of our information is found online. It's just shared for educational purposes. We mean no harm to anyone who has been affected by this case. If I do say anything wrong, feel free to leave it down in the comments, or if you just want to join in the discussion, we love to read your comments. I do want to say here, some of the names are based in Ethiopia. So if I do get any names wrong, I am so sorry. I did try my best to look it up, but if I say it wrong and you want to correct me, feel free to. But let's dive in. So Hannah was born as Hana Alemu. She was known as Hana Williams, but I don't really want to call her that because that would be her adopted name, and she just was not treated like a person or a family member. So she was born in June of 1997. She would honestly be the same age as me right now. She would have been 28, but unfortunately, she would only make it till she was 13. So Hannah was placed into the Kadain Meret Children's Home, which was a Catholic orphanage in Addis Ababa, which is in Ethiopia, after her family could no longer take care of her. So Hannah's dad had actually died, and her mom had just left her. Now, I don't know exactly where her mom went, if her mom couldn't take care of her or what really went on there, but Hannah's uncle would actually take in Hannah, and he tried to take care of her as best as he could. But he already had his own daughter, and he was struggling with poverty, so he wasn't really able to take care of her. So he thought that maybe putting her in an adoption agency and into an orphanage would be the best for her, that she would be able to just, have a better life. This orphanage was affiliated with an adoption agency called Adoption Advocates International, or AAI, that was based in Port Angeles, Washington. This agency is no longer working, I guess. They closed down in like 2014, which I will talk about in a bit. So, interesting enough, Washington actually has a high volume of people from Ethiopia. They have a high Ethiopian community. So it seems like the best place for Hannah to go to would be Washington, because she would be able to still have that culture and people that, maybe speak her language or just know what it's like to be from Ethiopia. And I actually did not know, like, Washington is like one of the third largest states that has a high volume of Ethiopians. I thought that was really interesting. And like most people who come from other countries and they want to immigrate to America, they want to come for a better life. But that didn't seem to happen for Hannah. In the mid to late 2000s, a lot of families, especially Christian families, were wanting that large family unit. And so adoptions began to skyrocket across America. Honestly, I think there's nothing wrong with wanting a large family. Personally, I don't get the hype, especially when you're getting into like the double digits. I don't know why you need that many children, but I digress. It's fine. I feel like you got to make a lot of money to be adopting a lot of kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you need to understand when you're going to adopt a child that they might and most likely will have trauma. But also, if you're adopting from other countries, like especially if you're going over to Ethiopia or China or wherever, they're gonna have like different cultures and values, which like no shit. But like you need to understand that you can't just be expecting to adopt a child and they're gonna just behave like you. So Carri and Larry Williams, they were this white Christian family. They were from Washington and they were wanting to have more children. Even though they already had 7, they were wanting to adopt, which I think is kind of crazy because I feel like how much money do you have to have 7 kids? Like, you got to be rich. Carrie could no longer carry anymore. She couldn't get pregnant. And so they began to look into adoption agencies and they found the adoption agency, which is actually a nonprofit agency that is no longer active, like I said. They've had a lot of controversies, which we will get through in this episode. But basically, how their system worked at the time of the case was parents would take courses and then they would have to do a home study to share their beliefs and how they would parent. This agency was known for not wanting people to spank their children, but of course, people are going to lie about what they did or what they're going to do. I don't know if this agency wasn't doing their proper research or if this is a typical thing with adoption agencies. I mean, I was never adopted. I don't know a lot of people that have been adopted, so I don't really know how it works. But basically, they would have these kids fly from wherever they were to the parents, which I think is so crazy. That idea scares me. I can't imagine like flying from Canada to like say Australia, even as like a 28-year-old. That would scare me. To go live with a random family, that would terrify me.
With a random family? Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
especially as a kid and they're not even speaking your own language. The Williams would finish their course, and this adoption agency would tell them that there was actually a younger boy named Emmanuel who was a deaf child from Ethiopia who was in need of a family. He was actually in the same agency as Hannah. Emmanuel was considered a great fit for Carrie because she knew American Sign Language. Now, I do want to say that Carrie knew sign language, but that does not mean she's going to be a great fit for a child who is deaf. As they were getting in to adopt Emmanuel, they would find this video of Hannah where she was just this healthy, beautiful girl with this adorable smile. And they would go on to say that their heart just went out to her and they wanted her. So back in 2008, these children would fly from Ethiopia to America with an escort without even meeting the parents. Now, this is no longer permitted by Ethiopia. They actually don't do any international adoptions as of now. They have pretty much stopped it because there has been a lot of craziness with people, as you can tell. So, what would happen is a social worker would come from the agency where they would just do a check-in on, like, the first day and then 6 months, and then they would wanna ask the parents for monthly reports on the children. At this time, it was described as a beautiful time. Emmanuel was doing so well. He was learning sign language, and Hannah was learning how to read and write, and she was doing so well, despite the fact that when Hannah first arrived, she was 107 pounds, but by 6 months, she would lose 30 pounds, making her 77 pounds, which made her in the 97% lighter than the average teenage girl. Typically, teenage girls can weigh anywhere from 80 pounds to 140. Obviously, there are other factors that can play into their weight, but this was an extreme weight loss. But after 2009, there were no reports ever made by the parents, even though they agreed to do these updates, but they weren't legally binding. So the agency couldn't really do anything about it, which I think is crazy. I don't know exactly how the abuse and neglect started, if it was immediate, I'm sure it was, but both Hannah and Emmanuel were very neglected and abused. Hannah was regularly physically abused. She would be denied food as a punishment. If she even made a comment about her clothes, or maybe she's arguing or saying whatever, she would be forced to wear a towel and nothing else, which is insane and crazy to do to a child, but especially a child where, she's hitting puberty. She did get her period the moment she arrived. So, of course, she's probably gonna be more aware of her body and she's gonna be very vulnerable. But besides any age, why the fuck would you just make her wear a towel? That is crazy to me. Eventually, Hannah would actually be forced to sleep in a barn that was 80 feet away from the house, or she would be forced to sleep in a shower room closet, and she would also have to shower with a garden hose. She pretty much was just treated like a dog. This just added to the humiliation and the isolation that Hannah and even Emmanuel were facing. Hannah wasn't allowed to interact with the other kids. The other kids were never allowed to see her. And, this is something you see a lot in abuse cases, especially towards adopted children, where they are neglected or they're treated as different. But this is like a high end example of just straight up isolation. During Christmas in 2010, Hannah and Emmanuel were forced to sit outside and watch the family celebrate Christmas. And it's probably snowing and it's cold. They also were being fed different meals that was just leftovers or sandwiches soaked in water. They had to eat outside no matter the weather. The only time they would really be allowed to be inside is if the family had guests, because of course they don't want other people to know that they are abusing these kids. So Hannah really loved her braided hair. It was so beautiful and she was just so proud of it. But Hannah apparently cut the grass too short, so Carrie just decided to shave Hannah's head, which is so insane to me. Like the concept of someone cutting the grass too short and you're like, "Oh, I'm going to shave your hair off." Huh? That's crazy. They were physically abused. They were constantly spanked, beaten with belts, any household objects. They were punished if they got their homework wrong or they weren't standing right or stealing food, which is such a common thing I see in abuse cases where parents always accuse their children or their victims of stealing food. Maybe the child is stealing food because, I don't know, they're being starved. Like, what the fuck? So, Emmanuel was also treated really awful. Carrie would run a plastic switch down his face, and Larry would also beat Emmanuel until he was bleeding. He would wet the bed only a few months into living there, and they accused him of doing this on purpose, when in reality, it's because of the abuse. That's like one of the main signs you see in children is wetting the bed. I always find it so frustrating when abusers abuse and then they're like to their victim, why are you acting like you're abused? It's brainworms, honestly. So Emmanuel was deaf, like I said earlier, and he would have to actually feel the vibrations of the stomping of Larry or Carrie, or he would literally be punished for not hearing it, which is crazy. If the other children tried to communicate, they would also be punished. One of the church members actually tried to communicate with Emmanuel, and Emmanuel was just taken away from them, which is insane. The Williams were very religious, and they were more religious than your average religious person. They were these fundamentalist Christians, and they would actually force Hannah to listen to Bible sermons and religious music, which was most likely probably stuff like "you're gonna burn in hell." It probably wasn't, "Jesus loves you" kind of stuff. It probably was like really awful stuff, but they actually owned this book. called To Train a Child by Michael and Debbie Pearl, which is written by these crazy fundamentalist Christians who believe in corporal punishment for children. They actually advocated to begin spanking children as early as a few months, and this book is very controversial. I actually looked this book up. I did not want to read it for this episode, but it is still being sold today, and it is so crazy. Like, they try saying that if a baby bites its mom's breast when it's like feeding, that the baby deserves to have its hair pulled. I'm like, that is a baby. What are you doing? This book is just super crazy and abusive, and I cannot believe that it's still being sold. And this book has actually been implicated in multiple cases of abuse and also death. There were these two children. One was an adopted child from North Carolina and a Liberian girl in California, where they were both murdered, and also Hannah. Now, Michael Pearl, he basically tries to deny that any of this happened, or he tries to say that his book does not advocate for murder or for abuse or any of that stuff, and that he actually laughs at his critics for even thinking that. I don't know about you, but if I wrote a book and I found out that parents were literally killing their children or just straight up abusing their children, I would want that book gone. I mean, I would never be writing a book like this in the first place, but still, the fact that he like laughs at his critics, like, sir, children are being murdered because of your book. It's honestly so crazy and appalling. And the fact that it's still being sold today is, I thought the book was going to be like banned. It's not. You can still get it on Amazon. It's so crazy. And so Carrie and Larry, they would use this book like a manual. They treated it like their own Bible. So they would punish both Hannah and Emmanuel a lot because they felt like they needed to train them. So when they were asked why they didn't do this to their other children, they would claim that their children were already trained and that they didn't need to do any of this because they had already done this. Because the one thing about this book is that they were telling you to train your children before they understand discipline. So I guess it helps the child, but it doesn't, obviously. We cannot ignore the major factor in this entire case. And that is Emmanuel and Hannah are from Ethiopia and they are black. And the rest of the family is white. This is just straight up racism. Their other children were not being treated the same way as Hannah and Emmanuel. This is not just a case of parents treating their adopted children really shitty. This just comes across as racist, extreme racism, and hate crimey. They would make a lot of remarks to Hannah about how she was aggressive, rude, dramatic, self-centered, attention-seeking, rebellious. But was she, or was she just a normal child? To me, this is straight up racist because these are words that usually racist people will describe black people, especially black women and girls, as being these aggressors, these loud, angry women, when in reality, they're not. And they would try and say that Hannah was carrying hepatitis B. Now, in some sources, they said that she was diagnosed with this. Some sources said the family accused her of this. So I don't know exactly if she did have it. But of course, to me, that's like another form of racism of treating her like she's diseased and she's just so different. And also, they're treating these children like they're animals, putting them outside, having her live in a barn. You cannot like look at that as anything else but as racist. The Williams accused Hannah of smearing her own blood and her feces on the bathroom wall. Hannah had started her period right when she arrived, and I want to say something. Side note, if this did actually happen, I feel like if I had a child and my child was doing this, I'd be taking them to a doctor or a psychologist because children don't just do this without any reason. And I don't really know if this even happened or if they were just trying to find anything to just use as an excuse to abuse Hannah. But let's say Hannah was doing this. There's probably a reason, and it's probably that she is going mad or she is abused and is going crazy. Like, that's what happens to victims, is they literally go crazy from it. The thing that makes me really mad about this, though, is the abuse and the neglect wasn't really unnoticed. So Carrie would attend a knitting club group where she complained about her two adopted children, that she hated them. She was actually mad that Hannah was 11 and she began her period. She literally said, I wanted a little girl, not a half-grown woman. And what's even more crazy is the women at this knitting group would say, well, why don't you just return her to the agency? Now, I will say, I think that's a crazy thing to do, but I do think that would have been a better thing for Hannah. But Carri would just say, "I don't wish her on anyone," which I can guarantee you 100% that Hana was nothing but a kind, loving, sweet girl. Oh, I get so heated when I think about this woman because, like, I just can't imagine, like, adopting a child and being like, "Ugh, I don't wish her on anyone." Now, I wanna say this too. First of all, if you're gonna adopt a child, you need to understand that child will age, and you cannot adopt a young girl and then expect her to not get her period. Some girls get their period as early as 8, sometimes they don't get it till they're 18. It's different, but your period can happen for multiple different reasons. It can be, like, traumatic experiences, it can just be from life. Sometimes you just get your period early. So, like, why are you adopting a child and hoping that she will stay a child? And they were actually wanting to change Hannah's age so they could kick her out. This girl was 11, 12. So, like, what are you doing? Like, why, what, how are you gonna try and, like, kick her out? People who were around did notice that Hannah was really excluded, whether it was that she wasn't allowed to play with the other kids or she was walking behind the family. She was never really around the other kids. And so they actually noticed this. The other kids in the house also reported that Hannah, she was really quiet because once she was spanked, she would stop crying. And like most abused children, she most likely learned to be quiet. Now, Carri didn't have to actually worry about teachers or classmates noticing Hannah or Emmanuel's abuse because Carri, of course, homeschooled her children. And actually, while I was researching this, I found out that 9 out of 26 children in Washington were homeschooled primarily because the parents were abusive and they didn't want the school to intervene, whether it was noticing the children having bruises or looking hungry or looking sad, which is so appalling. So Carri was basically doing everything she could to control Hannah and isolate her, and I just do not understand why. But Hannah's life would come to an end on May 11th, 2011. Hannah was being punished like any other time by Carri. She was forced to stay out in the cold wearing nothing but a short sleeve shirt and sweatpants. The temperature was dropping and it was raining outside. This is Washington's weather, so it was around 4 degrees Celsius or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And in order to stay warm, Hannah was told to just do jumping jacks. And she had been outside the entire day. Carri started to notice that Hannah was falling a lot, but she started to ignore it. She believed Hannah was attention seeking, trying to just get back inside, but this was just far from the truth. You can only abuse someone for so long until they can't take it. Carri was eventually trying to bring Hannah in, and she just told her sons, "Can you go and beat Hannah?" Makes zero sense. And so Hannah's step siblings, after Hannah was beat, they were watching from the window where Hannah began to rip her clothes off and thrash around and just act very erratically. And this was just not like Hannah. And when she began to bang her head on the ground, the siblings were shocked, and then she would just fall face forward into the mud. So when the siblings would go and get Carri to tell her that Hannah had fallen, Carri basically thought that Hannah was just being passive aggressive and was just being a brat. But when Carri saw that Hannah was naked, she was even more angry because she thought that Hannah was just being immoral and, I don't know, hypersexual for some reason. It was like Hannah had done this to piss off Carri. But actually, Hannah had died from hypothermia. And before her death, Hannah would go into this state called hyperthermic paradoxical. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's basically a state when someone becomes so hypothermic that they can't stand the cold that their body almost thinks they're overheating and they will begin to sweat and rip off their clothes trying to cool down, but it's irrational. And usually at this stage, people just die because, they're ripping off their clothes and they're in the cold. And if they don't get their temperature regulated in time, they will die. By the time Hannah was brought to the hospital, she was dead at the age of 13, covered in bruises. Her hair was shaved off. She weighed 77 pounds. She was so underweight, you could see her ribs. She died from hypothermia, neglect, and starvation. And of course, the doctors and everyone knew this wasn't an accident and that Larry and Carri were responsible. So the following morning, CPS actually would come to the house and try to speak to the children. But Larry wasn't letting them inside and said they had to come back with the police. So they had to leave, and once the police came inside, they noticed the family was acting really odd, as if Hannah didn't just die. They would soon talk to the children individually, and they noted that all the children were talking very rehearsed, kind of saying things like Hannah was bad and aggressive, and the police could kind of tell that these answers were all rehearsed. They would also interview Emmanuel, who would be able to sign and say, people like Hannah got spanked for lying and they go into the fires of hell. Which, if that does not tell you anything about what these children are being told, I don't know. But what's even more crazy is I thought that the parents would have been arrested right then and there, but they weren't. It actually took 2 months until July when the CPS got another call saying that from like this anonymous person that the Williams hated their adopted children and that Emmanuel was being treated just like Hannah. And if they didn't act fast, Emmanuel would end up like Hannah. So it wasn't until September of 2011, so 4 months later, when all the children were finally taken out of the home and Larry and Carri were finally arrested. So after they were arrested, Emmanuel would be seen by a doctor and a psychiatrist, and he would actually be diagnosed with PTSD. He was afraid to talk about what happened because he was afraid that he would be punished or that he'd be forced to go back to the home. He started to struggle with nightmares about waking up there and just being forced to go home. And one of the things I thought was so sad is when he was in his new foster home, he would apologize for a lot of minor mistakes and he would actually ask his foster mom why she didn't abuse him. How devastating is it for a child to be asking, why are you not abusing me? Because that's what they think is normal. That is just so devastating to me. Because of the trauma, Emmanuel's communication skills were very delayed because he wasn't really allowed to sign at all. And he was like 12 years old, so he was very behind. Same thing with his emotional state. During the trial, Emmanuel would state that he didn't know Hannah had died. So it would take him 3 days to testify with 3 different interpreters because of his level of trauma and his lack of communication skills. Of course, both Larry and Carri would blame each other. Larry would go on about how he couldn't believe that this had happened to his daughter, even though, what do you mean? Like, you could have stopped this. He would try and say that he was always gone for work, so he had no way of knowing about this. And Carri tried to play off this, I'm so weak and I didn't know how to take care of my kids, which is just like, then why did you go and adopt?
Like, why do you have 17 kids and the other 7 are totally fine, but these 2 children who, are clearly starving?
yeah, and it's just like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, you do not need to have that many children. If, like, I think she was just trying to play up this, I'm this small, blonde white woman who just didn't know what I was doing when it's like you knew what you were doing. Their defense tried to claim that they were struggling with mental health issues, which I will say I believe that they were struggling mentally in the sense of no one with a sane mind would even think to do any of this. But in order for you to even claim like the insanity plea, you have to prove that you were insane during the crime, which it can't be before or after. It has to be during. And of course, they were not in psychosis. They were all sane. During the trial, the jurors said they were so upset with the photos because they had to actually see Hannah and the photos of her body because the parents were trying to claim that she was a lot older than what she was. So they actually had to examine her body. It was just so awful. And they said they just wanted to scream because it was just so deplorable. At the end, the Williams trial would go on for 7 weeks, and they were both found guilty of first-degree assault of Emmanuel and manslaughter of Hannah. Carri would also be sentenced for homicide by abuse, which would sentence her to 37 years, and Larry only got 28 years because the jury couldn't really come to a full verdict of how much he was a part of it. I think this is way too low. 37 years is nothing. I think they should have gotten like well over thousands of years because this is insane to me. So, Hannah's story actually brought forward a lot of abuse that was happening in adopted children, especially in Washington. So, Washington's Department of Social and Health Services would write a report in 2012 about how there was over 30 children in 15 abuse cases that were all brought to the state's attention in 2010 and 2011. After Hannah's death, the adoption agency would change their policies, making parents sign a policy that details the tactics they won't use. And they changed the post placement reporting for a year, not just 6 months. And if parents don't follow that, CPS will be involved. But that agency would actually close down in 2014. There was a lot of like sexual abuse allegations and just a lot of craziness going on there. So yeah, it closed in 2014. They also were known for like stealing people's money. So there was just like a lot of stuff going on there. The people that were truly affected by this case, though, a lot of people were hurt, was the Ethiopian community in Washington. They actually would sit in the trial for the full 7 weeks because they wanted to create an impact to show the judge that this truly affects them, because a lot of people from Ethiopia that were adopted into Washington were realizing that a lot of them were treated like shit, and also a lot of them could have ended up like Hannah. But they also said they wanted to be there for Emmanuel. They wanted him to know that he had someone there, and they would actually keep in touch with Emmanuel even after. When he finally got adopted, they would actually take him out for dinner for Ethiopian food, which I thought was very sweet and kind. To honor Hannah, the Ethiopians in Seattle, they all came together and they would hold a vigil for Hannah, and they just wanted to advocate on her behalf. Mulu Mebet Reta was one of the members who attended the trial for all 7 weeks. She was the former president of the Ethiopian community in Seattle. She would actually arrange a stone, like a headstone for Hannah, that included her birth name. Meti Mulugita, who is a member of the Seattle Ethiopian community, also runs a support program for Ethiopian adoptees and their families. And she would go on to say that they still visit Hannah's grave and that there are still fresh flowers there, so people still honor Hannah. So then there was this writer, his name was David Gutterson. He was in the trial, like sitting in the trial, and he would actually write a book based on the fictional version of Hannah's life called The Final Case. I haven't read it, but apparently it's pretty good. And he said, in a way to try and help Hannah or do something for her, they actually would find Hannah's cousin from Ethiopia who had a life-threatening medical condition and she needed surgery. And so they actually were able to get a visa for her to have her go to the US and have surgery. So the Swedish Medical Center in Seattle performed the surgery for free, and Meti said it felt good to see something good come from Hannah's tragedy. She would go on to say, in a way, I would say it's healing for us. In a way, it's just to Hannah, we did right by you. I wasn't really able to find any updates on Emmanuel. He would be in his 20s now, and I just really hope that he was able to find a family that truly loved and appreciated him, and I just hope that he was able to heal in some kind of way. Because of what happened to Hannah, Ethiopia, and like a bunch of different situations with Ethiopia, they would decide to stop adoptions internationally. And currently now, a lot of Ethiopian support groups are focusing more of their attention towards Ethiopia because they are in a civil war right now. So they really want to focus on the children there. Hannah would have been 28 years old today. She would have been the same age as me if her life wasn't cut short at just 13. It bothers me to know like this stuff is still happening to this very day, and people saw this happen to Hannah, and if they would have just said something, called the police, they could have saved a life. And I just think that when we listen to cases like these, that we remember that these are real people, and if you see something, even if you think you're overreacting, just call someone, report it, because you could honestly be saving a life. I'd rather find out that I was overreacting, I was crazy, than find out that I underreacted and then find out that child would die. But that is where we are with this case. Thank you so much for listening to our episode. Again, we meant no harm to anyone who was affected by this case, and I hope I explained this with as much factual information and empathy as I could. And we will see you guys next week.